We need to talk about immigration. Everyone is wrong, the left and the right, because immigration isn't the cause of everything that's wrong in this country, although it is a problem. But the main problem started a very long time ago with something called managed decline.
You see wage deflation and productivity in Britain going down every single year. In fact, the productivity drop has been alarming over the course of the last 10 years. And what that suggests is we've become the cheap labour economy of the European time zone, and that actually this is no net benefit overall to the UK economy at all, though I confess it's good for the big employers, it's good for the big landowners. Is it good for ordinary Britons and taxpayers and workers? No.
And my problem with his assessment is I don't think he's wrong. So millions of people have come to this country legally. But why? Because I think it's the bet that Blair and Clinton could come up with to keep world peace. How? Economics. Globalisation with expanded financial avenues, because it wasn't pride or national identity at stake, but it was rich people's pockets. Manufacturing jobs had already been drifting overseas for years, but outsourcing the majority to the rest of the world really guaranteed peace. And so from the 90s onwards was the start of a massive period of immigration in the UK. If you see these graphs, that period of immigration really looks like it coincides with the period of stagnation in the UK. But why did the UK economy keep growing? Because there is no shortage of workers in a market economy. Put simply, if you have jobs that nobody wants to do, you have to pay them more to do it. But if you bring in workers from overseas who don't value money in the same way, you create an economy based on exploiting immigrants. Now there's a really good argument that this is just returning to the industrial age, but instead of using peasants as cheap labour, we used immigrants. But doing this completely suffocates wage growth. But the immigrants would do the jobs for less, and thus creating more profit for the companies. The economy would keep growing, and the rich are the only ones who would benefit. And in the meantime, the working classes in the UK get screwed. During this period, asset values skyrocketed because the economy was creating jobs, but not ones highly paid enough to buy houses. And the UK government sure as hell wasn't building them. So 2008 happened, everyone's borrowed more than they should have, and it's global financial collapse. But then how do you stimulate growth in the economy? Import more cheap labour, keep the prices the same, but just drive down production cost. It's effectively like robbing yourself. And so again, British workers got poorer while immigrants got jobs. But the margins over time get harder and harder to squeeze. America invests in tech and the UK does not. Nothing really changes in the UK, and this is when people start to really notice managed decline. See, one way to boost GDP numbers is actually to grow the economy. The other way is to import workers. And the more you import, the more the economy looks productive. And so the UK keeps rinsing blood out of a stone, but the country can feel something's not right. And then we get Brexit. And the UK isn't even sure why, but they know the immigrants are to blame. Coming over here, stealing our jobs. But in fact, what they're actually doing is coming over here and doing the crap jobs that the UK doesn't want to do because the wages aren't enough for anyone to live on, which the UK government facilitates. So after Brexit, the government realises it can't get workers from Europe anymore. So what does it do? Starts going to the rest of the world. And Brexit voters don't like that, because from their point of view, their home is getting more diverse, but they're getting poorer. And so the only thing that's changed to them is the immigrants. And again, this short-termism has been allowed to happen for almost 30 years. My point being, stop worrying about people on small boats and start worrying about the fact the UK government imported people from other countries to do your jobs because they didn't want to pay you more. And where this has really come back and bitten them in the bum is the fact now they can't afford the benefit system in this country. Now, I've heard someone point out that UK wages, if they'd grown at the same rate, what was an average wage in, let's say, 1995, was about £30,000, the equivalent now should be £80,000, but instead it's £37,000. So what that means is the tax receipts that the government are getting out of us are so much lower than they really should be. But this is their fault because they stopped the economy growing for the workers and allowed the rich to siphon off the profits. So the UK government are now scrabbling around going, how can we get more money? And so if you look at the price of how much, I don't know, the average benefit of anything costs, it's more than what the average person pays in tax. Well, whose fault's that? And I think the price that benefits have really gone up by is just what they would have if the UK had kept growing in the way it should have. These are prices for people to live above the poverty line. The problem is that most people in the UK are only just above it themselves with their wages. The government has enabled mass immigration. This is James Cleverly, former Home Secretary. He's here talking about how they're finally stopping overseas workers undercutting British workers.
We will stop immigration undercutting the salary of British workers. Yeah. We will increase the skilled worker earnings threshold by a third to 38,700 from next spring, in line with the median full-term wage for those kinds of jobs. Those coming on health and social care visa routes will be exempt.
This is the government finally acknowledging managed decline.
We will scrap cut price shortage labour from overseas by ending the 20% going rate salary discount for shortage occupations and reforming the shortage occupation list.
And this is also taken from the government's own website, listing jobs and scenarios where you can still be paid less than British workers for your overseas labour. And from reading the wording, you're still only expected to be paid the same as a British worker if you arrived after April 2024. So what this is telling me is that they filled understaffed areas of the economy by bringing in overseas workers and paying them less, instead of training British workers. And you can only assume they've done that because the money was not good enough to entice British people to do the jobs. And I hope what's becoming clear here is that I have no problem with people wanting to come to the UK for a better life. But there is a problem if we're both exploiting their labour and then suppressing wages to the UK population. Now, I'm sure many people will say, well, this is just sector specific. And as you can see, it's quite extensive. But people will advertise based on average UK salary, the minimum wage, and also the strength of bargaining position of the UK resident. Meaning if you don't have a bargaining position, you're going to get crap wages. And a company can literally say, we'll get someone who'll do it for less. That's not capitalism, that's corruption. And so I would argue that this is almost collusion from the British government to allow big companies to make massive profits. And again, if somebody can explain to me why I'm wrong, I'd really love to hear from you. So how do we fix the immigration versus wage growth problem? Well, firstly, we now have another problem. We have a huge ageing population in the UK, and we're going to need a lot of caring, nursing and end-of-life care for old people in this country. This sector is hugely underfunded and incredibly expensive to run, so we will need overseas workers to plug these gaps. I think we also need to bring back temporary work visas for seasonal work on things like farms when you're picking fruit or vegetables. If the wage is good for them to take back home, and it's good for farmers to stop produce going off, there should be no issue, as long as obviously they leave when their visa expires. And we need to get back to a much stricter work visa structure, very like the Australian model. We need to be advertising only in sectors that we absolutely need people, and they absolutely have to be paid the same as UK workers. One, out of pure fairness to the person on the visa, and secondly, to protect British workers in that sector. But if we pay everybody in the UK what they should be being paid, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, this will cause a huge amount of inflation. However, if I was the UK government, I would set up a commission to monitor price rises amongst UK businesses. Anyone found to be raising prices purely to maintain their current level of profit will be fined. And what I'm saying is that the business needs to incur the cost after so many years of collusion from the British government. And I personally would make the fine the difference in their profits of what they were found to have artificially raised their prices by. So the bigger the artificial rise, the bigger the fine. Companies will be told to make less profit. We need to stop allowing them to prioritise their share price and get back to offering a decent product at market rate. Otherwise, all these profits are frankly artificial and completely temporary, because we'll be proving their business to be unsustainable. I would also make it for anybody immigrating here to be able to access the welfare state for the first 5 years of being in this country. I know it's really harsh, but it would mean if they lost their job, they would be forced to move back to their home country instead of being a burden on the UK state. I want us to get to a system where we pay people fairly, but are very clear about prioritising UK citizens. And one thing I really want to address is this idea of getting rid of people who have lived in this country for decades. It's not happening. It's illegal, it's immoral, And if this whole sequence of videos hasn't hammered it home, none of what's happened in the UK is their fault. They have been taken advantage of in the same way the British public has. So when Farage starts spouting about removing indefinite leave to remain, from people who've been here for decades, call it what it is, aggressive nationalism, based on xenophobia and a wish to scapegoat an entire group of people to win an election.